This plenary session 3 is co-hosted and chaired by the Federal Office for Civil Protection, and it is my special pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Stefan BREM, who is the head of Risk Analysis and Research Coordination at the Policy Division of the Federal Office for Civil Protection. The Federal Office for Civil Protection in Switzerland is part of the Federal Department of Defense, Civil Protection and Sports. Stefan BREM joined the Federal Office for Civil Protection in 2007, and before he was with the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs Center for International Security Policy, where he was responsible for international aspects of critical infrastructure protection, security sector reform, border security, private military companies, and many more issues. It is my particular pleasure to have Stefan BREM with us because he is really the number one with regard to critical infrastructures in Switzerland. And in addition, he represents also one of our sponsors, namely the Federal Agency for Civil Protection, for the support for which we are, of course, very grateful. Thank you very much, Stefan, and the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walter, for these kind words. And since you already raised expectations very high, I keep my introduction short to give the panelists more time and also the audience more opportunities to interact with the panelists. And I'm very pleased to have this distinguished panelists here for the third plenary session. And as probably also some of you already heard a couple of aspects of resilience over the last couple of days, the aim of this panel is not to provide a unified or common definition of resiliency. I think there are a lot of different applications, whether on an international base or national base or even local based, last but not least. But to give certain aspects, and I think as a responsible agency for the national strategy for critical infrastructure protection in Switzerland, I'm certainly very pleased to have this topic based on the urban resiliency and also the critical infrastructure protection aspect. I also take the liberty to change the order of presentations a little bit so that we have in the beginning two rather conceptual presentations, first of all by Stefan Jacobson from the OECD, followed by John Bircham, and then that we have one of the critical infrastructure sector presented by Peter BURGHERR, the energy system, and last but not least, Yang Zhang presenting resiliency aspect when it comes to reconstructing housing. So I start with the first speaker, Stefan Jacobson. He is with the OECD, and there he has a leading role to coordinate the activities of the High-Level Risk Forum, which has issued several publications in the area of risk governance, and one of the recent publications is the recommendation for the governance of critical risk. And he will present some of the main findings of this publication, which are also have very important components how we can improve the resiliency of society. Stefan, the floor is yours. If you wish.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, Amand, for the kind invitation. As mentioned, the main purpose of my presentation today is to sort of share with you the essence of this OECD recommendation on the governance of critical risks, which is a tool to help set up robust governance frameworks, and help countries improve their resilience to major shocks. This was adopted and approved by the OECD Council of Ministers during their last meeting on the 6th of May under the chairmanship of Prime Minister Abe from Japan. Just let me provide you a little bit of context there. The fact is that across the globe, and as you have seen throughout these IDRC sessions, governments are facing novel risks in a complex landscape. There are increased major shock events with large-scale, complex transboundary and cascading effects that are also linked to the increased vulnerabilities of modern societies, both in emerging countries, but as well in OECD countries, with the mobility, the interdependency, interconnectedness of modern societies, the impact of climate change on specific sectors of the economy, and the concentration of people, wealth, and assets in urban and coastal development areas, which are particularly exposed. And also the fact that in this context, governments are not the same as they were 20 or 30 years ago. They often have reduced capacities as most of the critical infrastructures have been privatized. There has been a move towards decentralization, and so the direct government ownership and control is less than it was before. In addition, social media, the web, the media scrutiny are exposing governments to much stronger sort of control and are increasing the need for accountability. So this is a very challenging environment for government. And in fact, the OECD has been working over the past 10 years to assess this new environment and help governments shape and frame solutions. This chart shows the interconnectedness of modern economies with the mapping of global value chain and the participation of countries in this value chain index. And you see that countries such as Korea, the Slovak Republic, Ireland, or Belgium, or the Netherlands are very heavily involved. And in this context, critical infrastructures, to connect this to the topic of the session, are very key factors of resiliency. So this recommendation has been the result of 2 years of hard work, consensus building discussions in the context of the High-Level Risk Forum, and we are grateful for colleagues who have provided inputs and comments, and I remember very thorough comments from Stefan BREM last year. We are also cooperating in this context with the United Nations, and we hope that this can also represent a useful contribution to the revision of the Kyoto Framework of Action of the UNSDR. I took part myself in the preparatory conference meeting that was held in Geneva on the 14th of July on that topic. Basically, this recommendation has 5 key elements. The first one fosters a holistic approach to risk management. The second supports risk assessment, foresight, and financing frameworks. The third one advocates for a whole-of-society approach to prevention. The fourth one on strategic crisis management. And the fifth on transparency, accountability, and the need to foster continuous improvement. In terms of the first one, the goal is to establish and promote a comprehensive all-hazards and transboundary approach to country risk governance. In fact, it establishes the national strategy for governance of critical risks, the fact that governments need to take on leadership, but also to clearly define role and responsibilities. And the fact is governments should not and are not responsible for everything, but they need to define a framework for accountability where all actors should be empowered and clearly made accountable for their part of risk management. Still, the goal is to also foster a whole of government engagement strategy, aligning priorities across all departments inside the government, and that's why many of these risk management functions are often set up within the context of chancellery or prime minister's offices. They also need to sort of reach out and develop coordination mechanisms with local government, and beyond that, engage with the whole of society and public-private partnerships. I should also underline that this recommendation has been developed in full partnership with governments, but also with industry, and we have had the pleasure to have some major private sector partners, such as Swiss Re, Oliver Wyman, and others working with us to also express the need and the outcome of the dialogue with industry. The second principle supports risk assessment, foresight, and financing frameworks. And in fact, over the past few years, the OECD has taken on a leading role to foster national risk assessment practices, which had been championed in a core group of relatively advanced countries following early efforts in Switzerland, Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, the US, among others, who felt that the OECD was very useful to provide them with a forum for sharing practices. 2 years ago, I had the pleasure to present in Davos the G20 OECD framework for disaster risk assessment and financing, which was also our contribution in the context of the G20 finance meeting at the invitation of Mexico. So this second principle, in a sense, draws heavily on that framework and provides the bulk of the sort of framework analysis for national risk assessment. But it also adds an additional important element on financing mechanisms for contingent liabilities and the need to have clear frameworks within public finance context to assess risk-related contingent liabilities in the public budgets. And that was also discussed this morning during the plenary session. The third principle fosters a whole-of-society approach for prevention. The goal is to raise awareness of critical risks, to mobilize households, business, and international stakeholders, and foster investment in risk prevention and mitigation. There is this principle has some elements related to risk communication and culture, to business continuity with a focus on critical infrastructures, and also finding the right mix of structural and non-structural measures to manage risks. I think few of you were seeing there was a presentation on Japan earlier during this conference on building again some large seawalls in Japan, which is obviously a very structural measures to confront some of the risks. And I know that in the countries there has been a heavy debate whether to build large structural infrastructures like this, or foster other non-structural measures, such as leaving room for the river in some countries, or fostering the building of settlements and housing in areas that would not be exposed to tsunamis, for example, in the coastal areas in other countries. The goal is to unleash the potential for whole-of-society resilience efforts. And in fact, some of you who are interested in this topic can join us in the OECD-sponsored session on fostering resilience, which will be held afterwards as one of the breakout sessions. The goal is to, in a sense, analyze why investments in prevention are so limited despite their benefits, and analyze what is the impact of shortcoming in risk governance on resilience, and also to illustrate the role of institutions to help resolve gaps in resilience. The fourth principle is derived from our work on strategic crisis management, where we have had over the past 3 years regular meetings of the OECD Network on Strategic Crisis Management at the invitation of the Swiss Chancellery that were held in Geneva. The goal is to foster strategic crisis management capacities, to strengthen leadership, early warning, and sense-making, and also make sure that early warning systems, leadership, and government are well coordinated together, which often is not so easy to do in many countries. It has to foster interagency and international coordination, and also the capacity to foster subsidiary and scaling up of capacities when needed. The fifth principle is supporting good governance in risk decision-making to demonstrate transparency and accountability in risk-related decision-making by incorporating good governance practices and continuously learning from experience and science. It is acknowledging that transparency and accountability in risk management decisions are crucial, and they need to be based on knowledge and communication. There is a need that trade-off decisions are informed by the full risk portfolio, and that feedback mechanisms and continuous improvements are set in place. And in fact, at the invitation of our colleagues in Nordic countries from Sweden, Norway, and also the Netherlands, we will be holding a workshop in Oslo later in September, on 17-18 September, to discuss lessons learned from major disasters and how governments can set up quality assurance mechanisms. I invite anyone who is interested in this topic to come and speak to me at the end of the session about this. The goal is to foster trust in government and in public institutions. You would also see, if you look at this recommendation, that we were also able to put in some language to the need, related to the need to foster integrity and transparency, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that in the IDRC program, there are also some sessions related to the need to fight corruption in the context of risk management. It's particularly important in the ex-post phase when governments are often handing out large amounts of cash to distressed areas. If you want to keep and maintain trust in government, you have to absolutely maintain the fact that these sort of distribution will be both rapid, that often means that you have to relax some of the public control, but that at the same time you don't open up opportunities for corruption, which would undermine the trust in the entire system. We are also conducting reviews according to these principles, peer reviews, which foster cross-learning and experience and are providing an enabling environment for policy reform with useful policy recommendations. We are doing some of these reviews in partnership with the UNHCR and the European Commission in Europe. The goal is to foster credibility, objectivity, impact, and relevance in the context of risk analysis. And we have done some of these reviews over the past few years in countries such as the UK, Finland, France, Japan, Italy, and Mexico. And again, if government officials or some countries are interested to learn more or work with us on that, they can contact us. What are the next steps? I think the goal at the international level is to bring political momentum to risk management on the way to the Sendai conference on disaster risk reduction. That's a nice window in the international agenda that also includes the COP 2015 conference to be held in France next year, which will be about climate change, but disaster risk reduction has an important role to play in the context of supporting government efforts to mitigate the impact of climate change, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, which will have to be adopted later in 2015. The goal of the OECD in this context is to show that we can provide some added value, that we are complementary to the Hyogo framework of action. We are showing a focus on complex risk, and we are also underlining the fact that governance matters, and we are also underlining the role of a whole of society and whole of government approach. We will also be working on developing a policy toolkit to facilitate the implementation of the recommendation. Through our regular meetings with countries, we have a wealth of internal knowledge and good cases and policy lessons that we have, and we have to work. It will take some time, I would anticipate up to 18 months, to develop a web-based policy toolkit which can be helped as a resource for policy analysts in governments and also academia to foster the sharing of good practices. The goal is to support and evaluate countries' risk management policies and practices. I should also say that in the end, within 3 years from now, we'll have to report to the OECD Council on what is the progress that countries have made in implementing this recommendation, which will also provide a useful sort of tool to push countries and help to see how much progress they are making in this area, also helping to raise the profile of risk management within the overall portfolio of policies that exist at national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this very impressive overview of this very important, and I can highly recommend to read the brochure. I think it's also at the back of the room, but stay here for the next presentation. We have agreed that all 4 presentations are running in a row, so please keep your questions for the last presentations, and then we have enough time to actually address different issues. So I would like to continue with John Bircham, who is the principal of Bircham-Global Limited, a consultancy based in New Zealand. And I was just coming out of the breakout session on CIP, where he already talked about criticality and resilience. So I'm just wondering what color this elephant has that you are just talking about. The title of his presentation is "There's an Elephant in the Room and It's Anti-Resilience." Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I come to you today with a provocative title, and for those of you who understand the English idiom, there's an elephant in the room, means that there is something big in the room, but no one sees it. They're actually oblivious to it. In fact, there's a wonderful picture of a Banksy, or what you call it, exhibition, where he has an elephant in the room, and he has a lady sitting down there reading a magazine, totally oblivious to the existence of the elephant. So what's this got to do with everything? Well, to get you there, I've got to tell you a story. And the story is about a lady called Juliane Kopek. Some of you may know her story. Broadly speaking, she was thrown out of an aircraft at 21,000 feet when a Lockheed Electra over the Peruvian Amazon forest ran into a thunderstorm. The starboard wing was struck by lightning, exploded into flame. She remembers being strapped to her seat and falling towards the earth and seeing the canopy of the Amazonian forest beneath her. She remembers little beyond that except waking up, probably several hours later, heavily concussed, with a big gash in her arm, her glasses broken, and she was short-sighted. And you have to understand that she was a 17-year-old girl who the night before had done her graduation prom, and she was dressed in a miniskirt of the day. So she was exactly set up for jungle. Anyway, the story goes on how Juliane basically sat down and said, well, where am I? She looked around. She could find no one else around her. She called out. There was no response. And she decided that she was going to try and find her way out of the jungle. Now, I want you to appreciate that for a 17-year-old girl to make this decision, which is against nearly all the odds of what we would be taught, is quite outstanding. But the one thing that was in her mind, the one belief that was above all, and her father had put it in there, the jungle is not to be feared. She had lived for 18 months on a research station, an ecological research station in the Peruvian forest with her mum and dad who were scientists. And she had learnt about the way the Amazon works. But more than that, she also remembered what her father had told her, that water will run towards a stream will run towards a river, and the river will eventually get you some form of civilization. So she made a decision. She found a small spring of water, and I tell you, it was small. It was literally water bubbling out of the ground, and it was damp ground all around it. And she proceeded to follow this. As she got to bigger tributaries, she had a stick, and she put the stick in front of her to make sure there were no freshwater stingrays underneath her feet. She stayed in the middle of the waterways to stay away from the piranha. And as it got into bigger and bigger waterways, she said she floated down the middle of them. And she watched the crocodiles come in from the side, startled by this thing in the water they'd never seen before. Eventually, 10 days later, hallucinating, she came across a logger's hut. And she said she didn't really believe it was there. But she went up to it and touched it, and it was real. And she opened the door and went inside. And remember I said she had a big cut in her arm, in which lice were now crawling out. And so she got some petrol, kerosene, one of the two, and poured it into it. It hurt like blazes, but out came the lice. The loggers turned up some hours later, absolutely amazed at this Spanish-speaking girl. What was she doing there? And they canoed her out for 2 days to civilization when she was reunited with her father. Her mother died probably some days later at the crash site. 14 people also survived the crash. They found it afterwards. But they had decided to stay where they were. Juliane tells us how for 3 days she heard planes overhead and then they went away. Now you ask the question, John, why are you talking about this? Well, I want to ask a question. What would have happened to Juliane in respect if her beliefs in the context in which she found herself had been incorrect? Water does not flow to a stream and then to a river. And it's a very, very serious question, because this was her belief. Her belief was that water would flow eventually to a river, and eventually she would be able to find her way to civilization. If we have incorrect beliefs, but we believe them to be true, then we actual fact have some issues that we need to face. And I would like to propose to you that in terms of urban development, in terms of resilience, that there is actually an elephant in the room. And I want to explain that elephant to you. On your left, yes, you will see an old wine press. And I think for many of you, you would say that society is in relentless pursuit of greater performance, economic efficiency. They want more for less. Society achieves its objectives by solving its problems. And it solves its problems by increasing complexity, by integrating and connecting systems, by applying pressure to squeeze out any slack in the system. We all want more for less. And I'm sure some of you have been the butt of that in terms of restructuring, cost-cutting, etc., etc. So if we have this background, we have this pressure for complexity and efficiency, and it's driven by society to solve its own problems. We solve problems by increasing complexity, not by simplicity. And that's what makes the simplification movement so very, very difficult to comprehend, because the way we solve our problems is by ingeniously dreaming up new ways that involve different types of things, and it doesn't involve simplification. So we have a situation of where global competition, political imperatives, and I could have a list a mile long as to what these things actually are. They are driving optimization all the time. Efficiency, technical and social. Not only hard systems like dams and putting SCADA systems into both energy and to water or wherever, but also in the way we manage our social situations. The social one is just as much coming into complexity. And out of this comes overall greater technical and social complexity. But what drives it? What makes this happen? And it's a very, very simple equation if you look at it. It comes down to the fact that ultimately that we are looking for cost efficiency. As soon as we have cost efficiency, expectations of customers come, hey, it's more for less. I get more for my dollar, more for my bang. The demand for more for less drives optimization. But it's a totally non-virtuous circle, because on the other hand, we have the shareholders. And the expectations of those cost efficiency fuels their expectation for greater profit and cost efficiency. That too drives demand for profit, cost efficiency. Very, very non-virtuous. So I want to put this into the context in which we find ourselves, and I don't want to go into the realm of hard complexity. I'm going to use what I call structured, soft complexity. You'll see on the axis there, on the y-axis there, I have soft complexity going from low to high. And you see along the x-axis there, I have intensity of the cost imperative. And what I mean by that is how much pressure is there for reducing cost, for creating efficiency, downsizing, cost reduction, outsourcing. So if we look at this from a social and an organisational context, we often start off with a group, a company, an organisation, government department, doesn't matter what it is. And we will split it up. The whole objective in splitting it up is to make it more efficient. We know that if we have focus groups and we devolve or decentralise, then we're going to increase the efficiency. And then these same subsidiaries, to increase their efficiency, because they're under the hammer from the group, from head office, they too then, in fact, oftentimes, as with BP and many other countries, they have a mandate. The mandate is to drive the cost down of the contractors. That's their mandate. They're not there as technical experts, they're there as financial masters. No more cost, drive down. If you were to analyse the BP Deepwater Horizon saga, you would find at the bottom of it was this thing that I call the cost imperative. It had existed for 10 years, and Lord John Brown, or the Sun King as many know him, had put it into place. So we get contractors, and then we go and add subcontractors to that. And the part I want you to understand is that each time we split that up, we create another microcosm of risk, we create another microcosm of governance, we create all sorts of things that we end up with. We have a complexity that we don't even know exists. And the reason we don't see it is because we believe it is efficient, and because it's efficient, therefore that's what we must have. So our complexity increases exponentially. If you look at the bottom there, you'll see dependence and connectedness, actual fact, start to increase exponentially as well. And if we will look to the benefits of complexity, and for any of you who have read Joseph Tainter's work, you will see there that the actual fact is a marginal return. Many societies collapse because they reach the point of marginal return in which increasing complexity no longer gives the returns that are required. The most unfortunate part of this is that our resiliency decreases at the same time. So I ask the question, what if our beliefs in the many contexts in which we find ourselves are flawed, or at best incomplete? Beliefs that underpin and lead to behaviours that are opposed to, anti the very thing that we're seeking to do, resilience. You say, well, John, how is this? Well, I have observed many organisations from within. I said to one guy who was asking me, he said, look, I'm an organisational voyeur. I look, I peer, I look under the covers to see what's actually going on and to understand. And it was from this that this next concept came. This is the previous diagram, but the concept of a bow wave of risk. You see, as soon as you start cutting corners, whether they be through pragmatic attitudes in the workplace, shortcuts, non-procedural work practices, non-core but essential tasks and activities being left undone because there's not enough time in the workday to get them achieved, then you get Bruce, for those of you who know Finding Nemo, and that really explains exactly what's happening. The big shark there with the big grin after the little fella down there. Now, John, you're saying, well, this is crazy, what are you on about? Well, the bottom line comes down to being that we believe we're doing right, oftentimes, that our beliefs are correct, that society's belief that if we chase efficiency, if we chase all those things, then we'll get it right. I'd like to suggest to you that in the resilience context, we actually are not being that way. And this is Banksy's little exhibition. And I put on the word there, anti-resilience. There's an elephant in the room. It's actually anti-resilient. What we do is anti-resilient. But we don't understand that because we can't see it. See, there's a problem that we're oblivious to and we never talk about it. And I'd like to raise it and put this into this discussion because if we're aware of it, we can do something about it. But if we're unaware of it, we can do absolutely nothing. And ignoring the elephant doesn't make it go away. It just stays there. I think Banksy's exhibition site is absolutely brilliant. He ran into trouble with the local animal rights people painting the elephant, even though he was painting with non-toxic paints. I leave my questions there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. I'm John. You can talk to me afterwards and disagree with me, but I wanted to sound a warning. Thank you.
I think I did not promise too much. It's very impressive again, and I think certainly enough food for thought and also discussion later on. Certainly for one of the next presentation when it comes to energy supply and energy system in general, I think this picture is very important we have in mind. And there is also a German saying about an elephant in a dark room, and when you talk about definitions, different people touch on different parts of the elephant. One probably touches on the foot, the other on the bottom, other at the tail, other at the teeth. So these different components actually of the same animal or of the same component or term is also telling in that sense. So we will have now Peter BURGHERR from the Paul Scherrer Institute in Switzerland. He addresses a very important question about how to build resilient energy system. Also, there is a balance between safety, safety, security, and sustainability aspect. He leads a group that is responsible for interdisciplinary technology assessment, and he also works with the EU and also with some other government agencies, for example, with us. And I'm very pleased to have you on the panel too. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Stefan. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid we are producing only paper as scientists, so we are not painting elephants. And I probably will come now to the anti-resilience elephant. My title sounds quite ambitious: towards resilient energy systems, safety, security, sustainability. A lot of words in 2 lines, but I will try to run you through in the next couple of minutes. But first, resilience. If you talk to different people, you will hear everything between it's just a buzzword or it's a magic bullet. So you could also ask, is resilience management an extension of classical risk assessment and management, or is it just old wine in new bottles? Or coming back to the title, why should energy systems become more resilient? What are the advantages? Or how can we achieve it? Do we need new methodologies to measure resilience, or are existing ones sufficient? I could continue with more questions here, and I think most of them have some relevance, and it's right that people are asking that, and especially also that they are asking the scientists if it makes sense in a societal sense what they are doing. I will touch upon a few topics in the next minutes. So I will start putting energy system risk assessment in a broader context. Then I will come to a few terms and definitions. You don't have to be scared. This is just to underpin that we haven't changed everything just because we call it resilience now. And then I will say a few words about resilience and how it can be applied to energy systems. And I will end proposing that resilience probably is more like an umbrella for what we have been doing so far. Energy systems or energy technologies in the past 20, 30 years ago, or even more when we were analyzing the risks there, and basically we were looking at 2 different aspects only. So we were looking at random accidents, so these could be technical failures, natural hazards. Actually, I forgot human factors here. Or it can be intentional attacks, which range from vandalism to terrorism. So these incidents can have impacts on the performance of energy systems. More recently, extreme events have come into focus as part of these incidents. And of course, there have been many very inventive people who call them black swans, perfect storms. Also dragons have been used, etc. But basically, this is nothing else speaking scientifically than looking at very fat tail distributions of the distribution that we have. So it's non-Gaussian. And actually, if you invent such a name, then sometimes the people are also not aware that it's probably not meaning what they think of. So black swans, basically what Taleb meant there, it's a lack of knowledge. There was also a film a couple of time ago by Junger, which had the title Perfect Storms. So this is basically a conjunction of very rare events that then lead to something unexpected. But this is not a black swan. The one is randomness and the other one is a lack of knowledge. So this is basically the framework of classical risk assessment, how it has been applied to energy systems for a long time. Then in the 80s and 90s, we were looking in the scientific world, how can we extend this framework, which partially was fostered by developments from policy, politics, and other stakeholders. And basically, we can summarize that in 3 areas. So that's sustainability. Suddenly, energy systems should not only be safe, they should also be sustainable. This means we have environmental aspects, economic, and also societal aspects. So if you take environment, I mean, we can couple that to accidents, then it would mean, for example, oil spills. But there are then new issues such like greenhouse gas emissions. But economy, these are the costs, also very important. Societal aspects, we also have to consider subjective factors that we can hardly measure as natural scientists. Energy security, actually this is another umbrella term. This started a long time ago, and probably the first time when the concept of energy security in its was applied is when the English Navy was switching from coal to oil for their ships. So this was a very big discussion in the beginning if this is something that should be done, because basically they were switching from a domestic resource to a resource, at least at that time, that they had to import. So you're getting dependent on a foreign resource, but on the other hand, the argument was that they can import it from a diverse array of countries, which means diversification. And this actually, more than 100 years later, is still one of the key arguments when people say that you can increase security. But I mean, I have here put the 4A definition of energy security. Again, you can have many, many others. But the key message here, it's not only about supply of your resources, and it's not only about geopolitics, but you have also price is a very important role that can be an issue here. Climate change impacts can also impact on that, and all this goes back to our energy system. Then critical infrastructure protection. Energy systems are normally considered as a very important critical infrastructure, which is also highly interdependent with other critical infrastructures. So actually, again, John, we are moving into more and more complexity. So you see, we have already now increased our framework. We have many more components. And is this now resilient? Actually, there's even more, because we have also the word urban in the title of our session. And this is partially what comes in here under external factors, or very often these are also aggravating factors. If we do an assessment of the red boundary, then we also have to be aware of all these other factors that can play a role in our assessment. And then at the end, of course, science is very good to produce a lot of results, to invent highly complex frameworks and models. But to make this useful to decision makers, stakeholders, the general public, it has to be possible to put that into a decision-making process. And decision-making means also that we have to make trade-offs, compromises. We have to find robust solutions. We have to set priorities. And I think that's where the interface role of science is, that we have to support these processes with objective facts. And again, here comes in perception. In terms of energy technologies, we can take one of the most controversial technologies, nuclear. Just take two risk indicators. One is the number of people killed per kilowatt hour generated. Nuclear will perform excellent. It will outperform almost all other technologies. So, but if people hear a number like that, 5 to the 10 times minus 5, so 5 in 100,000 people are killed per produced unit of energy, then they have no idea what this means. So most people actually will look at the second indicator, and this is the maximum possible accident that can happen. So let's say, well, we can kill 40,000 people if the whole inventory of a radioactive inventory is released. And then this is where the fear comes from, where the aversion comes from, and which actually can very strongly drive the whole decision process, except of all the independent of what we have done in this red box up here. So that then leads to the last point here. It's very important also the communication of the results, and the people also have to understand how you are arriving at your results. For example, if we make decision support, there are basically, from a scientific point of view, there are two options. You can try to monetize everything, then you have to put a value of money, for example, on a human life. Again, you run into trouble, not everybody will accept that. But the beauty of this approach, of course, is if you have different technologies, in the end you will have a simple ranking. So one technology is top, the other one is at the bottom. Very easy to make a decision if you believe in the approach and if you don't care about the black box that is behind it. On the other hand, you can do a more complex and interactive approach, which has the name of a multi-criteria decision analysis. And there basically science only provides a set of indicators. So that would, for example, mean that you give numbers for greenhouse gas emissions for each technology, so that you tell people how many people are killed by an accident of these technologies. But then you are asking the different stakeholders, and they have to give their preferences, they have to weight these indicators, and then you combine these views with the scientific part, and in the end you, of course, can get very different rankings of this technology portfolio. And then, again, it's the task of the policymakers to find robust solutions and to make the trade-offs that are accepted by society. So if we add all of this, is this then resilience? Now I make a short intermezzo with a few terms, because I have mentioned a lot of words before. Safety versus security. This brings us back to the random accidents and intended attacks, for example. So it's very important that we make this distinction. And for example, in German, it's much more difficult to make it because we have only one word for safety and security. Risk, again, there is no agreed definition of that. And especially if we have projects where people from many different disciplines are involved, this means that we probably don't have an agreed definition. Natural scientists, they tend to the first of the two definitions I have put here, so we normally say just it's probability times consequences. In critical infrastructure protection, and particularly also the Department of Homeland Security in US was very much pushing for this second formulation, where you have threat, vulnerability, and consequences. And then, of course, this you can nicely represent with these three circles, and then, of course, the area of interest or the high-risk area would be the intersection of these. But then again, you have to define all your components of your equation. And even if we can assess the risk, we have to be aware that we have uncertainties. So uncertainty, again, can be random, or it can be lack of knowledge. Or more recently, in the context of foresight, scenario analysis, and so on, we have also added what is called deep uncertainty. So we can have a set of plausible futures, or we can, in the worst case, even have an unknown future. So this, and this, of course, means that it becomes more difficult for decision makers to understand what the scientists want to tell them, because they have we give them a mean value, and then we give them an uncertainty interval that is that large. So how do you make a decision? But let's come back to resilience. Resilience as such is also not really a new concept. And one of its origin is actually in biology, and in the 1970s when Holling was writing his seminal papers. And if you look at the figure here, he's depicting resilience a little bit different to what we see often in the graphical representations today, and what I will also show you in a moment. He has more or less a closed loop here. So you have an ecosystem that is growing, then it's reaching a plateau, there is conservation, and then we have an event which brings it back, and then there is a reorganization, and the circle is closed. Nowadays, here I show you the definition of the National Academy of Sciences. Resilience is seen as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. You see, we don't have a closed circle anymore. We have now a time dimension, and we have a functionality dimension on the y-axis. So we have the planning, the absorbing, recovery, and adaptation. And this is why in the very beginning I was asking the question, is resilience management an extension of risk assessment and risk management, because basically the circle you see here, this is our classical risk analysis, and then we are also doing risk management, which is basically the preparing and planning, and then the new part, the resilience part, is that we integrate that all and that we also have the absorption, recovery, and adaptation phases. Here, I don't want to say a lot. I just want to show you that science is very, very active in the moment. There are a lot of publications on the topic, but if you just look at this subjective selection here, then you see the words in red. You can say, well, there is a focus on frameworks and metrics. So this is, again, I come back to my initial slides. It seems that there is a need for new methodologies or to combine existing methodologies. So we have to go ahead. We cannot just use all the old tools with the upcoming challenges. So resilience as an umbrella concept. This is my last slide. Yes, I would say. But to foster maybe the discussion after these initial talks, I would say we should consider risk and resilience management as complementary and synergistic and not competing approaches. And the resilience approach has also to be operational. This means we must be able to apply these frameworks that are developed in science also in a policy context. And we have to be aware that we need context-specific applications because not every problem needs the same set of methodologies. And of course, we should try, to the extent possible, quantitative metrics. Thank you. And then maybe we can reorganize the chart I have shown you in the beginning and learn, and in the end, energy systems may become more resilient and at the same time still stay safe, secure, and sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you also very much, Peter, for your intervention. Very comprehensive. I think very important aspects we will discuss later on as well. Last but not least, we have Yang Zhang from the Virginia Tech, and there really is a program director of a newly founded Master of Urban and Regional Planning, and we'll talk about the social implication of disaster risk, especially in the area when it comes to building community resilience through sustainable housing recovery. So thank you very much also to you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Stefan, and dear friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for the opportunity to allow me to present my research and share that with you on social amplification of disaster risk. So let's see. So in the States, so in US, since the 1970s, a lot has happened at the federal, state, and local level to devise new policies, new programs, new initiatives to cope with disaster risk. And so in the meantime, we have advanced technology, modeling techniques. But however, our research on the four most expensive hurricane events, from 1992 Hurricane Andrew all the way to the most recent Hurricane Sandy, has shown that the current system still fails to address the problem of social application of disaster risk. So let me show you what I mean by this. So this slide shows you a model, show how risk to disaster was amplified through the disaster circle. So on your left is the pre-event axis. You have a different level of risk vulnerability. So obviously, because different structure type and different economic social capacity, and so you have different group of people, they have different vulnerability level to disaster. Okay, that's pre-existing before any event. Then event happened with second line. Okay, then after the event happened, so the risk of vulnerability inequality across different groups were amplified through the recovery process. So I think there are at least two stages the vulnerability or risk inequality was amplified. One happened right after disaster, which is during the impact stage. Okay, so you can see the gap between lines and getting bigger. Then after that stage, we enter into the recovery phase. And also in the recovery phase, you can see the gap become larger and larger and larger and larger. So I call that social application of disaster risk. So I believe what the reasons behind this is because we have a lens in the middle. We call that lens of vulnerability, because we believe that different population segment defined by the social or economic capacity, they have a different ability to cope with disaster risk. So as a result, our current system still fails to address this gap between a different population segment. We saw this amplified risk after disaster. So in next 2 slides, I show you 2 examples. So what is the consequences of this application risk? So first example is the 1992 Hurricane Andrew, which is a Category 5 hurricane, caused huge damage in south part of Miami-Dade County in Florida, US. So this simulation, I show you the 10 years of data, which is 1 year before Hurricane Andrew and 9 years after Hurricane Andrew. So you can see the long-term, long-lasting impact caused by Hurricane Andrew. So each red triangle is a newly abandoned or vacant property, a single-family house or multi-family house. You can see some area of this 5 small town really experienced serious decline within a 10-year period. Next example is a very recent, very well-known big hurricane, which is Hurricane Katrina of 2005. So this hurricane is different from Hurricane Andrew. This Hurricane Katrina is a water event. It caused huge flood damage. Andrew is a wind event. It's strong wind caused huge damage. But although it's different, but the consequences, the pictures are very, very similar. Look at this map, show you the 10-year period of data from 2000 to 2010, the change in occupied housing unit in the city of New Orleans. So in the red color, you can see after Katrina, so there are serious decline in some neighborhood. So this is what I mean, the consequences of social application of disaster risk. So let me bring you back to the model I showed you in the beginning. So this risk amplification occurs at least 2 stages. First stage is an impact stage. So I call it unequal disaster impact. This data is from Hurricane Sandy, which is pretty recent, 2 years ago, caused extensive damage in New York and New Jersey area. So I want to bring your attention to the 3 blocks on the table. So I want you to see the strong correlation between the income level and damage level. So from the top, you have low income, then middle income, then higher income. So 3 basic categories. So the trend is very clear. So lower income had more damage, higher damage, and higher income, less damage. Even higher income, even less damage. So this is for the owner-occupied housing unit. Next slide is very, very similar but different data. This table is for rental-occupied, rental housing. But the trend is even more strong, is much stronger. So lower income, higher damage, and middle income, lesser damage, higher income, even lesser damage. So this is, I call it unequal disaster impact, because the lower income folks, they have least capacity to cope with disaster, but at the same time, they tend to experience more damage. So that is so second stage, or second type of risk amplification is unequal disaster recovery. After impact stage, we now enter into the recovery phase. So I use this example to show you what's the risk amplification during this process. So this is Hurricane Ike, made landfall in Texas, coastal region. It's caused extensive damage. So this is compare the pre-event and the after-event, the rental unit and homeowner occupied unit, their recovery, the damage and recovery curve. So to make this figure very intuitive and easy to understand, we standardized the pre-event, which is base year data, the first point on the left, the pre-event data to unity, which is you see they all one. Then we saw how that changed over time. So year 1 is right after Hurricane Ike. You see the gap, you know. Then year 2, year 3, year 4, the gap become larger and larger and larger. So the top line is owner occupied, the bottom line is rental occupied. So you can see that over time, during the recovery period, and the gap between these 2 groups of housing really become really, really enlarged. This one is different data for Hurricane Andrew, but the same pattern. So same pattern, very consistent with what we saw in Hurricane Ike, although they are like more than 10 years apart. So before event, base year is 1, then you can see the gap between larger and larger. So that is same story, but different data set and different year and different locality. So this one, now we shift from rental and owner. Now we see a different housing type. We have a single-family house in the US, we have duplex, and we have the multifamily. You can see their kind of recovery trajectory. The storyline is very, very similar. You can see the enlarged gap over time. So the single-family housing, they fare the best. So they recover in comparison to duplex or multifamily, they recover the fastest. Then next to is duplex. The slowest one is multifamily housing unit. So as you know well, so multifamily housing unit oftentimes tend to be low-income housing or affordable housing in the US. So that's okay. And the other way of risk and application in recovery is, I call it gentrification. So I saw this in many localities. We saw this in Galveston, Texas, and we saw this in New Jersey following Hurricane Sandy. So what happened was that after an event in the disaster community, oftentimes, so there's a strong correlation of stakeholders. They are powerful stakeholders. They want to push others away. Okay. So in Galveston, so there's a strong correlation after Hurricane Ike. So they want to push, delay or push out the recovery or rebuilding of low-income housing and multiple family housing. So in New Jersey, what we went to Union Beach is a small middle class, lower middle class, and coast community in New Jersey, which experienced and a lot of damage after and Hurricane Sandy. And a lot of homeowners told us that they really feel the heat because there are lots of private investment company and also rich and stakeholders. They want to push them out and occupy the oceanfront land. So this is a process. As the recovery process goes along and people become more vulnerable, not only the people at the bottom, but also some lower middle class people, they feel the pressure or the financial pressure. They tend to become more vulnerable if given opportunity to be pushed away. So there's another picture we took in the Union Beach. So in summary, clearly we have a problem in US, so which is we still have not figured out a way to address this phenomenon, which is how to address the risk enlargement or amplification caused by disaster in disaster circle. So the question I would ask you to think about is, so what do we do? So my response to this question is at a higher level, I think we have to figure out a way to separate recovery from response. And the disaster circle has 4 components. We all know that. So preparedness, response, and recovery and mitigation. In the past, we tend to focus primarily on response. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that, which is perfect. But I feel like we need to, I believe we need to separate recovery from response because recovery and response, these 2 stages, they face very, very different challenges. They need different solutions. And I have to say that in the past kind of decade, we have seen some very positive movement in US. So the recovery now become a buzzword. So there's a newly established federal and recovery framework. So more and more attention start to look at recovery as a separate entity from response. So at a lower level, so the housing sector, so there are some action items I listed here. It sounds like very kind of self-evident, but actually to get this happen on the ground is a very, very challenging issue. So that concludes my comment. This is my name and email address. So welcome your comments and suggestions and for future project collaboration opportunities. Thank you so much.
Thank you also for the last presentation. Especially, I'm grateful for the policy implications of the last slide. So before we open up, I would like to briefly give a chance to the panelists to respond to what has been said by your colleagues. If you wish so, otherwise we just open up. Jan?
I would like to ask John a question. So John really provided a very provocative idea, anti-resilience. So from our work, one of the things we faced, we went to the ground to look at how locality recover from disaster, like Hurricane Sandy. So it's always a challenge for locality to manage, because and multiple agencies flew into the area from different federal, state, and local level. So coordination is really a challenge. So you pose a question, we need to simplify. If given a huge disaster cause very big damage, so how do we simplify that? So because locality, they don't have the capacity to do it on their own. They have to rely on kind of external people or resources coming in from outside. I just want to have your thought.
I think it's a lot simpler than you think. When you get into a situation like that, the complexity is not really there. In actual fact, what you're getting is people are simply getting up and helping their neighbours. And you'll see a lot of altruism, you see a lot of values. Where I see resilience coming in, anti-resilience occurring, is very much in this headlong pursuit, all cost, bottom line profit, and the consequences of that are we lose the values, but in actual fact that make resilience. The values are trust, the values are concern, they're values. Bottom line profit is not a value. Resilience is a human attribute based upon the capabilities we have as complex adaptive systems. I don't want to go into it, but that's where I see it to be.
Thank you, John. Any other responses right before we open up?
I would only remark that governments in nature are complex organizations which may at the same time be pursuing conflicting policy objectives. So you have some part in government that foster efficiency, competition, drive cost, and some other people are pushing resilience and trying to think about risks, and they do that at the same time.
And that was the whole point.
Well, I would probably add another point, because at the lunch before this panel we were discussing also if we would come to some sort of agreement or if we will all four speak of something totally different. And after hearing all of the presentations, I think we are speaking kind of the same language, or at least we can understand each other. I mean, if I take a presentation by Stefan, then I think his OECD has really nicely translated some of the dry scientific contexts into a policy use so that they can really be applied. Then I also agree with John's view that complexity is not always a good thing, although this is a tendency in science to become more and more complex. Where I would disagree with you is that complexity is always bad, or at least is viewed as bad, because we have many black boxes. You can take medicine or physics or chemistry, but there are some applications or products from which we benefit, and then as humans we are often accepting this. And on the other hand, it can be aversion, like in the form of nuclear power, because we don't understand the calculations for the safety and security there. And one last point, I thought your elephant is white. But this again shows that depending on the background that one has, you can already be driven in a certain direction. Because I was thinking like black swans, extremes, unknown unknowns. So it has to be an albino elephant. I see. And then the hurricanes, I think that's an excellent topic to demonstrate how the infrastructures are really going together. You were mostly talking about the urban impacts now, but if I look at them from an energy system approach, then of course we have a lot of critical infrastructures. We have the offshore installations, we have the refineries, etc., which are also affected there. And then of course, again, already you have a second sector which is affected, and government has to take a decision if the industry doesn't manage on its own, where do we put the resources and the money to help?
Can I respond, Peter, very briefly? I think the complexity is not all bad. It's the way we actually use complexity that's at issue. Yeah. In other words, it comes down to if we are chasing the dollar bottom line at all costs, then the outcome will be anti-resilience. But complexity is the only way that humanity advances. In other words, we solve problems through complexity. We make something, how can we improve it? How can we make it work better? The issue at stake is that it does follow a marginal return. In other words, there'll come a time when it's not, unless we get a disruptive technology. And that's what's kept us going. Some form of disruptive technology has arrived on the scene, and all of a sudden there's a whole new vista. The old marginal return curve no longer applies. That's my view on it.
Okay, thank you very much for the interaction on the panel. So I think now it's time to really open up to the audience. I would like to invite you to provide both experience or questions, comments, and please at least keep the comments short and precise. So we have the first intervention on the front.
Hello? Oh. Hello, my name is Dale Rothman. I'm from the University of Denver, and I very much enjoy these talks. And first, quickly to John, I teach a course in basic systems thinking, and I think one of the key things to point out in your diagram that explains why the way the complexity is causing the anti-resilience is that you've got two positive feedbacks in there, and in the pursuit of efficiency, we get rid of all the things that don't contribute to immediate efficiency, and we forget about, in systems terms, the negative feedbacks that will take that. So if one piece breaks, there is some redundancy, and it's, I think, a very significant thing. And I also, Yang, I think it is very interesting to see the evidence that you're presenting on the social amplification of risk. There has been some work on that, looking at things like drought, et cetera, and I just wanted to comment. I find it very enlightening that you're actually, how you're implementing that in this case.
Hello, this question is for John Bircham. I'm Monica Gowan. I'm New Zealand educated and have had the opportunity to live in New Zealand, and I'm native from Minnesota. As you were speaking about anti-resilience, it made me think of my perception of how things Kiwi are done and my appreciation for it and how that can translate into resilience, especially after living through part of the Canterbury earthquake sequence. My question is, at the time I was there, I became aware of some work by a Kiwi legal scholar that was comparing New Zealand's value of natural justice to American self-determination. And those two are resonating for me as you talk about what is the value that creates the resilience. And my own experience of seeing how people helped one another in Christchurch maintain and develop resilience and adaptive capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things that sort of, I watched this with absolute amazement in Christchurch, was the student army. When it turned out, and for those of you who don't know, the student army, those in charge didn't really want these students running around because they represented a health and safety risk. All right? They were out there, there were no regulations, there was no supervision. So they just organised themselves with shovels and they went out and they cleaned up liquefaction in street after street after street. They did a magnificent job. They didn't have to be asked, they just did it. And I think this is sort of when you start getting into the real values of humanity go beyond that. You find this altruism sitting underneath it all. You see this, look, I'm not going to use it, it's a spiritual value, and I don't quite know how to go beyond that. I just don't want us to lose it as humanity. Thanks.
Hi, thanks a lot. I'm Tina Komas from the University of Agder, and I have a question for the whole panel, also in part inspired by work with my great colleague Antonella from Adelaide. So she has a social science background, and I'm more from the quantitative disciplines. And we have been trying to work around characterizing resilience. And I would like to hear from you what you think should be, or what the function of quantitatively measuring is, as opposed to trying to characterize it and get to the values that you were talking about, such as trust or community-based values. Do we need to measure it at all? Do we need to come up with something that we can push into formulas? And if so, what should we focus on?
Yeah, I think resilience is an outcome. So if you want to characterize an outcome, it's intrinsically difficult because it's a sort of a broad notion of performance. There is one easy way, which is economic resilience, which you could characterize after a crisis, the time it would take to go back to a pre-crisis level. For example, after the global economic crisis, we are witnessing countries such as the UK or France, after 5 or 6 years, have finally been able to make up the losses of the crisis. But if you look at overall values such as trust and social capital, this is quite difficult. But this is an area which has also caught the attention of policymakers, because in the broader notions of well-being and measuring social capital and having these broader notions, there is actually some work underway at the moment on how you could measure trust and the level of engagement of citizens in public institutions and one with each other. On the other policies, in fact, measure, and then you can also measure all the throughputs and all the institutional factors. And I think a lot of people are busy with this at the moment in many institutional frameworks, and we at the OECD will also try to do what we can to try to assess and see to which extent measures and institutions are here in place that would, in theory, help to ensure greater resilience.
I know that there are a lot of attempts to characterize almost anything, any concept that is in a way abstract. My question was rather related to what should we try to quantify and make measurable, because we tend to think that once we've quantified or come up with a measure of trust, we know what trust is and we can measure it. I know you're shaking your heads, but I mean, that's why you come up with a measure. If you think your measure is not adequate, then why do you choose it? So why do we have that drive to make these things so measurable if we just want to know something like a comparative value, or are we prepared for something that can happen? And in how far do we then not acknowledge that we can never be prepared for anything?
Well, I can probably say a bit more about how we are measuring things or indicators when we are doing our analysis, our comparisons of energy systems or energy scenarios. And yes, it's true, as natural scientists we have a strong tendency to make everything quantitative. But in the end, when we are meeting with different stakeholders, we are absolutely aware that there are also factors which we cannot quantitatively measure. So, and then in such cases, we are actually doing what you just said. We are using simple scales where we just put values relative to each other, or even just yes or no, or 0 or 1. So this actually can all be combined in a decision-making process in the end, even if you want to make it in a very formal way, like this multi-criteria analysis, which I have mentioned. There you can mix all these different types of scales and indicators, and we are actually also collaborating with social scientists like you're doing, because we believe that this is the field which should not be measured by the natural scientists themselves.
Yeah, resilience, I think I'm now convinced it's not measurable. But I think there are proxies for it. And one proxy that is really exciting me is something that's been developed by some colleagues of mine, Carl Gibson. And for those of you who are in the infrastructure breakout room, we discussed a little bit about what that was. Essentially, it is a measure of how much, in fact, it's not my word, this is the words of one of our clients, it's the amount of wiggle room you have in a particular situation. And whether, how much room is there to manoeuvre. And if I can describe it very, very simply from its origins, which came from a pilot, and for those of you who have ever flown an aircraft as the captain or first officer, there are some manoeuvres where you've got a ton of room in which to move. There are other manoeuvres where if you make a mistake, you're going to spin. And that's that, and that's all there is for it. So to come back to it, can I say, is it something we should be chasing quantitatively? No, I don't think it is. But I think we recognise it for what it is, describe it for what it is, and allow it to go alongside of our quantitative measures. That's just my view.
Maybe just one short addition. I'm not sure if it's the right question to ask if we should measure resilience. I think we should rather measure aspects that are relevant to achieve resilience. And this is then also why we don't have to invent the wheel totally new, because we already have several indicators that can measure certain aspects of resilience.
So I have to say that I sort of agree with John's comment. I'm also sort of anti-resilience, because it's not because I don't believe resilience, but because this term has been overused. In my view, I think resilience is a philosophy. So it's a very high-level kind of concept. It's beautiful, but it's not practical. So I think if you want to make this whole concept more practical, devise kind of indicators to measure it and how to implement, and you have to divide resilience to different components. And to me, I think the old-fashioned cycle of disaster management, response, preparedness, recovery, mitigation, is a way to do it. I think now, in the past like 50 years, we have done a lot of work to measure response, what's the capacity for response. And we have done a lot of work to measure what's good mitigation. We have done a lot of work to measure what's good preparedness. I think the one area which lacks is recovery. So we still don't have no idea what constitute the capacity for neighborhood which has been affected by a hurricane, what made them can recover faster and better, which means, okay, they can rebuild very quickly, as well as they can become stronger. So to that end, I think recovery measurement is a area which need more discussion and more research, and also because actions always take at local level. So you have to have involvement from locality to no matter what kind of measurement you want to take. So there are lots of variations from India to China to US to Japan, culture, and tradition. All of that factors will play into how a community can rebound from disaster.
Before we conclude, we have two last questions or comments. We just take them together, and then the panel have the chance to respond them also together. First in the first one.
Thank you very much, Thomas Ebeling from the United Nations University. Just to comment on this discussion about whether we should or could quantify resilience, measure it, versus sort of qualitative acknowledgements of complexity, I think this very much, in a way, goes back to this discussion of anti-resilience and the elephant in the room, meaning this drive to make for efficiency in a way, because unfortunately, probably also from a political side, there's very much a demand for cost-efficient solutions and measures, and of course a quantitative assessment of whatever it is that easily ranks for you sort of the different options is the most cost-efficient or most efficient, often is the most efficient way to do that. So I think there's an interesting link to this idea of anti-resilience. Thanks.
And the last question for Patrick Helm.
Thank you. Pat Helm, New Zealand. Peter's example of the electricity system, I think, tends to underplay the value of resilience because electricity and all of the possible failures are still a relatively simple system. If you put electricity into a community or into a city or country, and then all the other forms of infrastructure, and then all of the human organisations and all of the other that create the function of that country as a whole, then risk methodologies that you might use in a single industry are nearly irrelevant, I think, in such a complex environment. And that's where other measures such as resilience come into play, particularly the building of generic resilience. I think I agree with the earlier speaker's comments that it's extremely hard to measure. It's an emergent outcome of many processes. But I think it's not just a matter of semantics. It's a very useful idea, complementary to, quite distinct from risk management, and that in understanding national security or security of quite complicated systems, risk management on the one hand, resilience on the other, and even adaptive management tend to form a layered system which has ultimately a lot stronger than any one measure might give. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Any concluding remarks from the panelists? You wanted to say something before, Stefan?
I just think that the challenge is when I think you work in countries or in government, that at some stage you have to be able to catch the attention of some of the ministers or make even it possible for a prime minister or president to make some decisions and policy trade-offs and to say, yes, this is important, this matters, we have to do something. And you have to convince them and in order to be able to crystallize attention and resources that ultimately will serve to improve well-being, you'll have to be accountable for that. Things will not just happen because you say or because you advocate. So you have to be able to put facts on the table to show what works, what does not, and in this area to what results can you yield. And even though it is a very complex system, I think intuitively, as mentioned by Patrick, policymakers at a very senior level, they understand the nature of the beast and they understand that this matters very much. But in order to be able to justify useful social, economic, and financial investment in this area, I think we also have to demonstrate results and to assess the performance of policies and as mentioned, define some ways of best practice. That's at least the essence of what we are doing here.
Maybe a very short comment to the last statement. I agree with the first part that, of course, if you look at interconnected infrastructure, it becomes much more complex. But this, actually, I was just focusing on one infrastructure in my talk. I wouldn't agree with your second statement that some of the established methods for risk assessment become totally irrelevant, because I see also there a danger that we are then just giving also a very good opportunity to science to come up with some new fancy frameworks. I could show you a lot of new frameworks which you will never be able to apply in your governmental work to measure resilience, because it's just not applicable. And I mean, it's the same as if you would say the opposite. The classics are supreme. I mean, that's what we have believed for a long time, that the old Greeks basically solved all the problems and that we cannot surpass them. But then suddenly we found out that some of their thinking was not right. So I think there's always two sides.
I don't want to run too much on the break, but I was told that there's still time for a very last question. Please.
Thank you very much, Monica Gowan. A couple of comments. Briefly, I've spent years in the literature on resilience, looking at how to operationalize and measure it. And I think it's well established that resilience is both a process and outcome, for one. And second of all, that there's a need for measures because we need some way to be able to intervene and build capacity. And we need evidence in order to decide how we're going to build that capacity. And that relies on generalizable and representative data. And so we try to measure resilience through many different constructs and many different approaches, many different schools of thought about how to come about it. You might be a social cognitivist, you could be a process engineer, whatever. But the desire is to try and come up with a way that you can communicate how these certain attributes are shown in people and how you can promote them and build them so as a process and outcome they can go on to that positive resilience trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the last intervention. I think that really brings us to the end of this plenary session. I would really like to thank you both on the panel for the very interesting and obviously thought-provoking statements, and also for your comments and questions. So thank you very much for your attention. And I give back the micro or the floor to the conference chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I didn't want to interfere and with the chair by allowing an additional question. I just saw that we are not too gender balanced in general, so at least we can achieve it in the Q&As. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for allowing the last question. Saying this, I want to be very brief. It was a very interesting panel. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, panelists. Interesting discussion. From a personal perspective, I would, of course, very much love if we could somehow measure resiliency, because $1 we spent in a not efficient measure is missing on another side for a measure which probably could be much more efficient. And I think I still would encourage all of us to think about how we can somehow quantify or better handle what really resilience is. My dream would be that we could come up with expressing, for example, a city being a triple A city, like in other systems where I have to confess that this rating is probably not, has not proven to be very powerful, but probably let's think about how we could really bring resilience forward. Thank you once again, Mr. Chair, dear panelists, and as usual, I would like to present you a modest gift expressing my deep gratitude for that excellent panel. The gift which consists of a certificate saying that we are allocating means to retrofit one building in Bangladesh, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 additional houses retrofitted in Bangladesh. Thank you very much.